morning schedule board outside the operations office looked normal at first glance. White laminate, black marker, dates stacked in clean rows, PT at 0600, motor pool maintenance, a live fire exercise planned for the end of the week. The kind of routine that settles into a unit after months, without surprises. One of the sergeants noticed the change while drinking his first cup of coffee. A single line had been added beneath the training block. No location, no supporting units, just a tasking code and a date range that didn't match anything else on the board. When he asked the clerk who'd written it, the clerk said he hadn't. When he checked again after lunch, the line was gone. No one mentioned it in formation. No correction was issued. The schedule moved on as if it had never been there. That was the first trace of the operation, and for most people, the last time it appeared in writing. Years later, when veterans began comparing notes, what stood out wasn't a single shocking event, but how ordinary the beginning had felt. They described being selected quietly. No announcement, no explanation, beyond being told to pack light and be ready within 12 hours. Family notifications were deferred. Paperwork was handled later. The phrase came up often enough that it stuck. One infantryman said it felt like being temporarily erased from your own unit. The earliest detailed account came from a captain who, at the time, served as an operations officer attached to a provisional joint task force. He remembered the briefing room because it wasn't set up for anything unusual. Folding chairs, a dry erase board with half-erased notes from a previous meeting, no slides, no maps handed out. The officer who delivered the briefing didn't give his name. He spoke plainly and without emphasis. The mission was described as limited in scope and duration, reconnaissance and assessment only. No engagement unless necessary. The location was referred to indirectly, using distances from known borders instead of place names. There was an operation name. The captain was certain of that. He repeated it during the interview, slowly, as if making sure it still existed, once spoken aloud. It wasn't dramatic or symbolic. It sounded administrative, almost forgettable. He wrote it down later, on a scrap of paper, then destroyed it. At the time, he said, it felt excessive. Years later, when he requested his own service records, the deployment window associated with that name wasn't there at all. 3 weeks missing, no temporary duty orders, no location codes, nothing to suggest he'd been anywhere. He assumed it was an error. Most soldiers do. The deployment began at night. They boarded aircraft without markings anyone could later describe clearly. Seating was improvised, cargo netting along the sides, red interior lighting. No manifest passed out. No one explained where they were going, beyond forward. They landed just before dawn on a hard-packed dirt strip, reinforced with metal matting. No signage, no host nation personnel. The perimeter was already established, but no one could say by whom. It felt like stepping into a place that had been prepared and then abandoned mid-task. Every account describes the environment the same way. High desert, pale, chalky soil, sparse vegetation that looked dead even when it wasn't, wind that never fully stopped. During the day, the light flattened distance. At night, sound carried farther than it should have. Their objective, as stated, was to observe and assess a cluster of structures several kilometers from the landing area. Not a village, not a base. Concrete foundations, partial walls, no roofs, no utilities, no signs of recent habitation, but also no clear signs of age. It looked paused rather than abandoned. They established an observation position on slightly elevated ground and spent the first 2 nights watching nothing happen. No movement, no lights, no heat signatures that held steady long enough to identify. Drones were reportedly overhead, but none of the ground personnel ever saw or heard them. Communications were unreliable. Radios worked intermittently, even when line of sight was clear. A signals specialist recalled having to reorient his antenna every hour, despite nothing else changing. He logged it as atmospheric interference and moved on. The first irregularity occurred on the 3rd night. Multiple personnel reported hearing engines in the distance around the same time, just before midnight. Not aircraft, not tracked vehicles. The sound was low, steady, and uniform, as if several identical machines were moving together. Night vision showed nothing. Thermal imaging showed nothing. The sound approached, then stopped abruptly. No gradual fade, just silence. After several minutes, it resumed farther away, and then disappeared entirely. They documented the event, or they believed they did. Every veteran recalled filling out the same report format, noting time, direction, and duration. When later asked to produce those logs, none were able to. There are rational explanations for this: fatigue, acoustic distortion in desert terrain, equipment malfunction, lost paperwork. Every person I interviewed acknowledged those possibilities without prompting. What unsettled them was the consistency. Different observers, different equipment, the same description, repeated years apart. On the 5th day, their orders changed. No formal briefing, no explanation. They were instructed to move closer to the structures they had been observing. The phrasing was vague but firm. Updated guidance, revised tasking, command interest. As they closed the distance, details emerged that hadn't been visible before. Shallow markings cut into the concrete. Repetitive patterns, not writing, not recognizable symbols. Intentional, but difficult to interpret. One medic described them as resembling tally marks, but arranged incorrectly, as if counting something that didn't follow familiar logic. They took photographs, multiple devices, redundant storage. Those images have never been recovered. When veterans later requested clarification about the operation, the responses followed a pattern. No such mission on record, no authority to release information. In some cases, no acknowledgement at all. One former NCO summarized it quietly. "It's not classified," he said. "It's removed." This is where the story pauses. Not on violence or confrontation, but on absence. A mission remembered clearly by those involved, yet erased so thoroughly that even the missing pieces feel deliberate. They were told the move closer was temporary, a daylight movement, in and out, then back to the observation position before dark. No one was issued additional ammunition. No one was told to expect contact. The tone of the order suggested routine, even though nothing else about the mission felt routine anymore. The structures looked different up close. That detail came up repeatedly, even when I didn't ask about it directly. From a distance, they appeared uniform, almost modular. Up close, the dimensions didn't line up cleanly. Walls that should have met at right angles didn't. Doorways were slightly too narrow or too wide to feel standard. The concrete itself was uneven, poured in sections that didn't match each other in age or composition. One engineer attached to the task force said it looked like several construction phases had overlapped without coordination, as if different groups had worked from different plans. and never reconciled them. Inside the largest structure, the temperature dropped noticeably. Not dramatically, but enough that several men commented on it independently. The medic said he checked his thermometer twice, assuming it was malfunctioning. It wasn't. The interior was several degrees cooler than the surrounding air, despite no shade and no airflow to account for it. They moved slowly, methodically, clearing rooms that contained nothing, no furniture, no equipment, no personal effects. Dust lay undisturbed in corners, but not evenly. Some sections looked swept. Others hadn't been touched in years. The markings became more frequent the farther they went in, not just on the floors, but on vertical surfaces, sometimes at shoulder height, sometimes near the ceiling. Always shallow, always deliberate, the same repeating forms. One soldier admitted he tried to photograph a specific pattern 3 times because his camera kept failing to save the image. The device worked immediately afterward when pointed elsewhere. He laughed about it at the time. He stopped laughing when he realized no one else's photos from inside the structure were usable either. About an hour into the movement, communications degraded further. Radios still transmitted, but responses were delayed or distorted. Voices sounded slightly out of sync, as if words were arriving out of order. The signals officer logged it as interference, but noted that it didn't match known profiles. They received a check-in from higher headquarters, asking for a status update. When they replied, the response came back altered, not garbled, but incomplete, as if entire sentences had been removed. The most consistent account from this phase involves a sound. Not engines this time, something lower, more irregular, described variously as wind through a confined space or pressure shifting in large cavities underground. It wasn't constant. It came and went, always just below the threshold of being identifiable. Several soldiers reported the same sensation while it was happening, a feeling of being observed without a clear source, no visual confirmation, no audible cue that matched the feeling, just an awareness that didn't align with what their senses were reporting. Again, there are rational explanations: stress, hypervigilance, the power of suggestion in a confined, unfamiliar environment. Every veteran I spoke to acknowledged that. Some insisted that's all it was, but none of them could explain why the feeling dissipated immediately once they stepped back outside, even though the structures were open to the air and not sealed. They withdrew before nightfall, as ordered. No incident, no contact, no injuries. On paper, the movement should have been unremarkable. That night, however, the engines returned. This time, they were closer. Multiple sentries reported the sound originating from different directions at once. Not overlapping, but sequential, as if something was repositioning around the perimeter. Thermal imaging again showed nothing. Night vision showed nothing. One soldier requested permission to fire illumination. The request was denied without explanation. The sound persisted for nearly 40 minutes, then stopped. When it stopped everywhere at once. The next morning, the order came down to prepare for extraction. No debrief, no after-action review, just instructions to pack up and be ready to move within 2 hours. Several men noticed fresh tire impressions near the perimeter that hadn't been there the night before. Not tracks that led anywhere, just partial impressions, as if vehicles had arrived and departed vertically rather than horizontally. That phrasing came from a staff sergeant who paused after saying it, aware of how it sounded. No one photographed the tracks. Extraction was as quiet as insertion. Unmarked aircraft. No explanation. No acknowledgement that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. When they landed at their originating base, they were told to resume normal duties immediately. There was no decompression period, no counseling, no documentation handed out to explain where they'd been. Within days, the operation stopped being mentioned at all. One by one, soldiers noticed discrepancies, pay that didn't reflect time deployed, medical visits during the window that were no longer visible in the system, a gap in leave accrual that no one could account for. When questions were asked, answers were deflected. System lag, data migration, clerical backlog, each explanation plausible on its own, less so when stacked together. Years later, some of the men began experiencing similar patterns in their personal lives. Sleep disturbances, recurring dreams set in the same terrain, always ending before anything happened. A persistent sense of having forgotten something important. Several reported an aversion to wide-open desert spaces they hadn't had before. One said he couldn't explain it to his family without sounding irrational, so he stopped trying. What ties these accounts together isn't a single extraordinary claim. It's the accumulation of small, consistent details, the missing records, the identical descriptions of sound, the same phrases used by different veterans to describe something they couldn't fully articulate. When asked why they think the operation was erased, opinions vary. Some believe it was a bureaucratic anomaly, a black-budget mission folded into another program and scrubbed for convenience. Others think it intersected with something that didn't fit existing frameworks, and erasure was easier than explanation. No one claims certainty. What they share is the conviction that something happened and that the act of removing it from the record was intentional. In the final part, we'll look at what happened after these veterans began speaking about the operation publicly and why attempts to document it seem to encounter the same resistance even decades later. For a long time, nothing happened after they returned. That's important to say, because memory has a way of reshaping silence into meaning after the fact. Most of them went back to their units, back to training cycles, deployments that were documented, rotations that showed up exactly where they were supposed to. Careers continued, some advanced, some got out. Life moved forward in ways that looked normal from the outside. It was only years later, usually triggered by something mundane, that the operation resurfaced. For one former staff sergeant, it was a routine VA records request. He was filing for a knee injury he'd picked up on a different deployment, one that was fully documented. When the packet came back, he noticed the gap again, the same 3-week window missing. This time, instead of assuming error, he asked for clarification in writing. The response didn't deny his service. It didn't acknowledge it either. It simply stated that no qualifying deployment could be verified for that period and suggested resubmitting with additional evidence. He didn't have any. Another veteran, an officer who had since moved into the private sector, tried a different route. He contacted an old colleague who now worked in a civilian intelligence role, not asking for details, just asking whether the operation name rang a bell. The reply came back hours later. One sentence: "I wouldn't use that name in emails." No explanation followed. As more of the men began quietly reaching out to one another, they noticed something else. Their stories hadn't drifted over time the way most memories do. Details were fuzzy around the edges, but the core elements remained fixed. The terrain, the structures, the sound at night, the missing documentation. They also noticed a pattern in what happened when they tried to formalize those memories. Requests filed through official channels stalled indefinitely. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls were transferred and then dropped. In a few cases, veterans reported being contacted directly and advised politely that continuing to pursue the matter could complicate unrelated claims. No threats were made, no orders were given, just guidance. One man described it as being reminded, gently, that the system was larger than he was. There were attempts to document the operation outside official avenues. A journalist made initial inquiries after hearing fragments of the story through veteran networks. He requested comment from multiple agencies. None responded. 2 weeks later, he informed his sources he was no longer pursuing the piece. He did not elaborate and later stopped returning messages altogether. A historian specializing in irregular warfare noted something similar. When she attempted to cross-reference satellite imagery from the approximate time frame and region, she found anomalies in data availability. Entire days missing. Not classified, not restricted, just absent. She published that observation in an academic forum. The post was taken down within 24 hours for reasons that were never specified. Again, there are rational explanations: bureaucratic inertia, data loss, institutional reluctance to revisit poorly documented operations. No one I spoke to dismissed those possibilities. What unsettled them was the repetition. Different people, different methods, the same outcome. Over time, the men involved began to change how they talked about the experience. Early conversations focused on what they'd seen and heard. Later ones shifted toward what the operation represented, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a boundary they had brushed up against without crossing. Several veterans used the same phrase independently. It felt unfinished, not unresolved, unfinished. One former medic said he sometimes dreamed about the structures, but never entering them, always standing just outside, aware that something inside required attention he couldn't give. He said the dreams weren't frightening, just persistent. Another described a lingering discomfort with record-keeping itself. He became meticulous, almost obsessive, about documenting his own movements and decisions, as if trying to compensate for a period of time that had slipped through the cracks. None of them claimed the operation involved anything supernatural. In fact, most were careful to reject that framing outright. They emphasized how ordinary it all looked on the surface: concrete, dust, radios, orders passed down and followed. What troubled them was how thoroughly it had been removed afterward, and how little effort seemed to be required to make that removal stick. War, by its nature, produces gaps in understanding. Fog of war isn't just a metaphor, it's an acknowledgement that perception, memory, and record rarely align perfectly. Most veterans accept that. They live with it. This felt different. It wasn't the absence of answers that lingered. It was the presence of intention behind that absence. One retired officer put it this way: classified things eventually get declassified. Mistakes eventually get admitted. This didn't feel like either. It felt like something that was never meant to exist in the first place, even while we were standing in it. There is no final revelation to offer here, No document that suddenly surfaced. No whistleblower stepping forward with proof. Just a set of accounts that refuse to disappear, even as the paper trail insists they never happened. The operation remains erased, not forgotten, but deliberately excluded. And maybe that's the point worth sitting with. That in modern conflict, it's possible not only to conduct an operation in silence, but to remove its echo afterward, to leave behind only memory and the quiet unease of those who know memory alone is considered insufficient evidence. Whether this was a bureaucratic anomaly, a compartmentalized mission gone wrong, or something that didn't fit cleanly into existing frameworks, the result is the same: a blank space where something once was. And for the people who stood on that desert ground, listening to engines they couldn't see, that blank space is still there. Whether it was stress, misinterpretation, or something else entirely, these stories have been shared for years, quietly and consistently. If you've made it this far, take a moment with the story before moving on, not to decide what it was, or to force an explanation onto it, but simply to acknowledge that some experiences don't leave evidence behind, only witnesses. If you've served, and parts of this account felt familiar, or if you've encountered stories that don't sit cleanly in official records, you're not alone. These gaps exist, whether we talk about them or not. If you think this story is worth preserving, consider sharing it. Leave a comment if you've heard similar accounts, or if you have questions that don't have easy answers. And if you want more long-form, grounded accounts like this one, subscribe to the channel. Some operations are forgotten by design. Talking about them may be the only way they remain.